I'll do some reading and then we'll do some listening. The reading is of a text I wrote for the latest Occulto 6 live. And it was written and released in late November 2019, so just a few weeks before we first heard about the new coronavirus. And the title is Degenerates, Degenerates, They Will Turn into Humans. Notes for a non-anthropocentric book club. Open quote. The marmot is the stupidest animal on earth, said the ethologist. It stands still for hours on end, contemplating the sun. The ethologist is the stupidest animal on earth, said the marmot. It stands still for hours on end, contemplated me. End quote. Enzo Costa, own translation from Italian. First chapter. You, me, and everything else. I created you for me and everything else for you, said the singer of the small music ensemble, with a smile on her lips. To introduce their performance at a cultural event in Berlin, she read aloud one version of a very famous story, The Myth of Human Creation. A few days earlier, a musician and school teacher friend had complained about how many self-deprecating and yet self-centered "we deserve an extinction" type of rants she happened to hear or read in her circle of acquaintances. At the first World Climate Conference in 1979, climate change was pinpointed as a serious problem. 40 years after, it's late 2019 as I write, we are living in a planet made so hot by our big shots and, by the look of things, not far from turning into French fries, as Klaus Nomi put it in his 1981 apocalyptic masterpiece, Total Eclipse. Even on the verge of the catastrophe, we haven't lost the focus on ourselves and our sense of importance. The stories we tell, as different as their source, genre, goal, and inspiring vision may be, are still often reducible to the line, one or more humans try to achieve something, and end up breaking what they consider or were told are their fancy toys. I reckon it is virtually impossible as humans to completely cast off this or similar plots, but I also believe that we currently need, more than ever, to tell and read stories that shift the focus away from us. Stories in which humans are gone, haven't arrived yet, or simply step aside. In this text, I will talk about some of them. Second chapter, before, after. If you wish to develop a pre-anthropocentric discourse, Ediacaran Biota could be a wonderful and highly symbolic starting point. Under this name, we group a whole wave of mysterious Precambrian creatures, possibly the earliest examples of multicellular life. Ediacarans represent another life that has been challenging to describe, understand, and classify, exactly because it's so different from what we are used to. No violence, no predators, plenty of accessible food, slow movements, if any. They have been described as a possible failed experiment in the evolution of life, but on a geological timescale, it's always hard to know who will have the last laugh. Ediacarans have been discussed on Occulto's pages, both in this issue in Giulia Liberti's Keeping Up with Ediacarans, on page 34 if you have the issue already or if you will have one, as well as in an article by Massimo Sandal in our issue E from 2013, which he recently expanded into a book chapter of the newly released La Malinconia del Mammut, which only exists in Italian for the moment. Post-anthropocentric is a more established term, and we can expect the discourse developed around it to bloom and sprout further in many directions in the near future. A book titled After Man seems to fit perfectly with the topic, although it doesn't consist of recent philosophical speculations, but rather of commented illustrations of fantastic creatures produced some 40 years ago. The book imagines, describes, and depicts how animal life would evolve in a distant future, 50 million years from now, in which humans are long extinct. The evolutionary effects are particularly dramatic and funny in isolated conditions, such as in the fictive Batavia Islands. where bats evolved to cover most ecological niches, from scary predators to plant-like creatures, a clear hint at the role that the fauna of the Galapagos Islands played in Darwin's development of the evolution theory. Published in 1981, a facsimile reprint came out in 2018, so I will show it to you. It's a very beautiful book. After Man is a milestone of speculative evolution, a sort of phantazoology with a rationale developed both independently and in collaborative projects by scientists, artists, and nerdy amateurs, often with educational and entertaining purposes. My knowledge and interest regarding the wondrous and colorful pages of After Man owes a lot to a 2015 Occulto article, again by Massimo Sandal, All Tomorrows, The Lonely Dreams of Speculative Evolution. More and more scientists and scholars are taken to imagining a post-human future, but the richer bibliography on the topic is probably still found in fiction and rooted in the sci-fi genre. French author and computer engineer Catherine Dufour was recently in Berlin for a program of talks and panels about literature and AI. And, asked about how she conceived the scenarios of her sci-fi stories, she said that starting from a world where humans don't exist anymore can be a very good and refreshing idea. A case in point she named is one of my big favorites, Clifford D. Simcoe's City, a 1952 novel that merges previously published short stories and additional notes. I have a beautiful and very old Italian edition from the legendary series Urania, curated by Carlo Fruttero. The title was first translated quite differently to Anni senza fine. There are several editions in different languages of it. So the main subject of the book is a series of legendary tales told by super intelligent dogs that reconstruct the gradual extinction of humans. I'd like to avoid spoiler, but it will do no harm to tell you that one of the main characters is a robot butler, and that mutants as well as other animals beyond dogs play an important role in the story. The underlying message of the book is that humans are over-ambitious bullies who will always end up breaking everything. Which, wait a second, is exactly the kind of story I said we should try to avoid at our non-anthropocentric book club. Setting precise boundaries can be tricky, but let's not give up. City remains a unique, innovative and much less human-focused novel than usual. The animals here are animals, not plainly allegorical, as for example in Orwell's outstanding but very anthropocentric masterpiece Animal Factory. Third chapter, Nature Intelligence. The drafting of a non-anthropocentric reading list can also start by simply asking our self-centered selves, what makes us so special? The answer will likely invoke our self-awareness, cognitive skills, use of language and communication, ability to make decisions, solve problems, build tools. In short, our intellectual qualities, our intelligence. Such an answer rests on shaky grounds. First, intelligence is not exclusive to humans, and not even exclusive to closely related species such as other mammals or some birds, which are at least vertebrates like us. I tried a crow cracking nut search on Google Video and it produced over 85,000 relevant results. There are, in fact, intelligent animals who are invertebrates based in the ocean and whose less common ancestor with humans must be looked for as far as 600 million years back. Octopus and other cephalopods. The popular science must-read on the topic is the international praised Other Minds, The Octopus and the Evolution of Intelligent Life, 2016, by philosopher of science Peter Godfrey Smith. A beautiful and engaging book in which biology meets philosophy meets scuba diving. And here I show you an early edition in English. I think it's been reprinted already and translated at least to German and Italian and a few more for sure languages. In Godfrey Smith's words, Open quote, cephalopods are an independent experiment in the evolution of large brains and complex behavior. Thus, they represent an occasion to explore the development of subjective experience, consciousness, and intelligence without having to study ourselves, with the obvious bias and limitation this always brings. The book is not just about cephalopods, but if you're a fan of them, you won't be disappointed. Expect detailed insights on their interaction and communication abilities, on the ever-changing colorful patterns, as well as hilarious and moving anecdotes about their smartness. How a lab octopus squared it with water, only the one scientist it didn't like. How a group of octopuses purposefully sabotaged the lighting system, so successfully and so often that they were then released back into the wild. How their awareness of living in captivity has led to changes in what they are allowed to be subjected to as testing animals. If you think such achievements are not impressive compared to a human who can, for example, go to university and write a PhD, let me ask you, who says that writing a PhD is a good idea? In other words, who gets to decide that our intelligence and what we can do with it is so much better and different from what other creatures do? We did basically make this decision, and you'll agree that this is pretty unfair, to say the least. In the story this text begins with, a third party tells humans the world is yours, but for the time being I'll consider that a matter of human interpretation as well, as views on the human-animal-environment relationship vary significantly among believers, also among monotheists and within the same religion. The reading I want to recommend on the topic is no less than Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species, first published in 1859. I have here a Penguin Classic edition with me, which by chance has a Damien Hirst 2008 picture on the cover that was painted exactly for this purpose. You may call it an obvious choice, but we'll probably never stop rereading it and we'll never get enough out of it. According to Alan M. Anderson, scientist, science journalist, and New Scientist's editor-in-chief from 1992 to 2005, open quote, the idea of human superiority should have died when Darwin came on the scene, end quote. The bare process of evolution by natural selection based on random variations described by Darwin doesn't require or imply any qualitative judgment or any process of improvement. The concept of fitness is relative, and being fitter doesn't mean being better, but rather something like better adapted than others to the current conditions. Darwin's tree of life doesn't depict linear progressions, and previously evolved species shouldn't be seen as a more primitive or simple version of later ones. Some newer branching can actually lead to degenerations or dead ends, while several ancient species still thrive successfully. One for all, jellyfish. If humans are part of the evolution game, there's nothing special or different about them, and that's the end of it. Of course, once placed in context, evolution theory is much more than that, and things get more complicated. The words Darwin decided to use, the non-scientific readings that influenced him, in particular Malthus' population theory, the modifications and additional contributions introduced by prominent supporters such as Thomas Huxley and Ernst Haeckel, the social and historical context of late Victorian England. Each of these, as well as other factors, played a role which is hard to quantify and disentangle from the rest. Darwin himself, a respected gentleman born into a wealthy and prominent family, was well aware of the implications of his theory for the human status and worried about how not only the scientific establishment and the church, but also his wife and his acquaintances would react to it. He acted wisely and planned a long-term communication strategy to establish himself as an acknowledged expert on make the theory acceptable and successful. It worked, and it's one of the reasons why we always talk about Darwin and much less about Alfred Russel Wallace, of humble birth, who independently conceived a very similar theory of evolution in the same period. On the origin of species focused on observational evidence and on less controversial topics such as case studies from artificial breeding. Darwin even mentioned in a letter that he didn't mind if people needed to consider human species as a special case, even though he personally didn't feel the need to do so. He would address the issue more directly in a book only later, with The Descent of Man, 1871. More on the topics approached here and the history of Darwinism at large can be found in the relevant chapters of Making Modern Science by Peter J. Bowler and Ewan Rhys Morris, and in a previous book by Bowler, Evolution, the History of an Idea. I have Making Modern Science with me, that I also really recommend. And I don't have the book by Bowler alone, but I brought something that is not in the text, the autobiography by Charles Darwin in this beautiful edition, which can for sure also be a useful reading to understand more about him and his theory, and about our ideas on animals. There are two more controversial aspects related to intelligence that I'd like to mention here. We don't know exactly what it is, nor where it might be located. As a consequence, we can't absolutely define, visualize, or measure it. We have all heard of the intelligence quotient, IQ, and probably tried one or more of the standardized tests that are meant to assess it. But we may also have heard about the limitations of both the concept and the tests. The latter are mostly focused on certain abilities such as deductive logic or verbal skills, fail to be culturally neutral, and so on. In itself, the search for reliable quantitative methods to check mental abilities sounds more reasonable than plain arbitrariness and can help social progress. One of the pioneers in the field, the Frenchman Alfred Binet, focused on the assessment of retardation in school children, establishing the so-called Binet-Simon scale, 1905. Binet underlined the limitations of quantitative methods in this context, as well as the relativity and flexibility of intelligence and its development, and seemed to support a non-marginalizing approach towards kids with special needs. But things didn't always look as palatable in the field. The book recommendation here is Stephen Jay Gould's The Measure of Man. First published in 1981, it is not the newest you can get on the topic, and surely needs to be put in perspective and integrated with a look at more recent literature, if only with an overview on the Human Genome Project and its results. But it's still a rich and impressive historical and technical overview. The debunking attitude may sound old school, but I don't mind a bit of fervor in a field that caused so much injustice and suffering. The horror of eugenics, absolutely not limited to National Socialist Germany, is particularly infamous and sadly known, but the full list is much longer. I let Gould speak here, quoting from the introduction of The Measure of Man. Open quote. This book, then, is about the abstraction of intelligence as a single entity, its location within the brain, its quantification as one number for each individual, and the use of these numbers to rank people in a single series of worthiness, invariably to find that oppressed and disadvantaged groups, race, classes, or sexes, are innately inferior and deserve their status. End quote. Of course, scales and tests that assess mental skills are used routinely by researchers, social workers, psychologists, human resource managers, and other professionals as indicative and statistical tools for useful or at least relatively harmless purposes. The harmlessness of job interviews may be a matter of debate, but people usually get out alive of them. A deeper look into the research about human and non-human intelligence would broaden its perspective to include non-quantitative methods, such as the one of Freud's psychoanalysis, as well as the history of the physical or structural approach that partially converged and developed into contemporary neuroscience. An iconic example from the 1920s is the slicing of Lenin's brain into over 30,000 pieces by prominent physician and neurologist Oskar Vogt. A new chapter, The Life of the Others. And the last one, Once more, as humans, it seems hard, if not impossible, to step outside ourselves and identify with non-human others. If you do want to try, you'll need a lot of imagination, along with tools and techniques to visualize and describe what you imagine. In short, art. Or possibly a mix of art and science. A unique figure in this territory is without a doubt Jean-Paul Lévy, the French director known for his animal documentaries mostly focused on water fauna. Sea urchins, shrimps, seahorses, crabs, jellyfish, and of course octopuses, among others. The 2019 book, significantly titled Zoological Surrealism, The Non-Human Cinema of Jean-Paul Lévy, is focused on the first 25 years of his career, 1924-1949. So, there you go. This is a nice cover with an octopus tentacle taken from Paul Lévy's film, of course. The author James Leo Cahill talks about a Copernican potential of cinema that would find in Paul Lévy's work a particularly conspicuous and striking fulfillment, a shift in attention from self-regard to non-human other. He adds that, open quote, the films of Jean-Paul Lévy develop a mode of looking and the practice of cinematic encounter that, in turning its attention to animal life and non-human worlds, also critically alter the conceptions of human life, end quote. Jean-Paul Lévy's background and fields of action are a transdisciplinary cat's cradle. The son of a prominent mathematician and politician, he was trained in comparative anatomy and histology. Closely connected with and influenced by the French Surrealist movement, engaged in far-left political activism, sometimes protesting against his own father, a frontline promoter of alternative cinema networks and an eager experimenter in regards of filming techniques, yet able to reach the general public and big theaters with the most successful films of his. A well-known quote of his and title of another book about his work published by MIT Press reads, "Science is fiction." It would make a great tagline for Occulto hadn't we stick to slightly modified lyrics from a Throbbing Crystals song. The tagline of Occulto is "We need some disciplines in here." The comparative anatomy discipline, which had a great influence on Paul Lévy's vision and work even after he had interrupted his career as a scientist, was founded at the beginning of the 19th century. The French naturalist Georges Cuvier, 1769-1832, well remembered for having first demonstrated, by analyzing the remains of a mammoth, that species extinction did occur, gave crucial contributions to its establishment together with other prominent naturalists such as Geoffroy Saint-Hilaire and Richard Owen, who we all envy for coining the word dinosaurier. Comparative anatomy was therefore not that old at the time of Paul Lévy's studies, and yet it was already destined to disappear soon, or rather to be partially incorporated into new ways of approaching and studying the living. The birth of modern biology saw a lot of tension and oscillations between different places: the Natural History Museum, the lab, the natural habitat, and different focal points: the species, the individual organism as a whole, its main structures, its ultimate components. According to science historian Evelyn Fox Keller, as expressed in Physics and the Emergence of Molecular Biology, A History of Cognitive and Political Synergy, a paper from 1990, biology tried to mimic physics, its agenda, language, attitude, and techniques, in an attempt to gain a similar kind of success, authority, and resonance. This would have contributed, starting from the 1930s, to the rise and prestige of molecular biology, which appeared more prone to mathematization, more analytical, and somehow difficult enough to be compared to physics. Such developments and strategies are not without consequences. Quoting from the above-mentioned Making Modern Science from 2005 by Bowler and Morros, open quote, molecular biology is essentially a reductionist research program. It seeks to explain the phenomena of life, heredity, and development in terms of behavior and chemical molecules. Some of the most successful biologists now argue what they that the way forward is to reduce everything to the law of physics. Those who seek to understand the way living organisms function in the natural world, including ecologists and evolutionists, are frustrated by the molecular biologists' tendency to dismiss their work as just old-fashioned natural history. The jury is still out on the extent to which biology will continue to be dominated by the molecular approach in the 21st century. End quote. While thinking about these issues, I made up in my mind the phrase balkanization of biology, and then discovered that it had, of course, already been invented and used. For example, in the Science article British Biologists Learn Small is Not Beautiful by science journalist David Dixon in 1981, or in a short and amusing text by biochemist Gregory A. Petsko published on Genome Biology in 2000 entitled The Dark Side. Moving forward, or rather backward, to the 17th century. We can't discuss the art and science of observing and identifying with the non-human other without mentioning the painter, illustrator, and officially amateur but groundbreaking naturalist Maria Sibylla Merian. Born in what is today Germany and later based in Holland, her work focused on insects and plants. I recommend here my own favorite, Metamorphosis Insectorum Surinamensium, first published in 1705. This is a German edition, translated from the Dutch original. It also exists in many, many languages, I think. It consists of a series of 60 incredibly beautiful colored etchings depicting insects in the various phases of their lives, together with the plants, flowers, and fruits they like to eat and stay around. Each figure is accompanied by a short, simple but brilliant description. Almost all the subjects were observed by the artists in their natural habitat in Suriname, at the time still a Dutch colony. Merian had traveled there for research purposes at the age of 52 and stayed there for 2 years, actually shorter than planned for health reasons, bringing her daughter with her and no male companion, which was not such a common thing to do in 1699. Insects are animals we are not likely to feel for, let alone identify with, and many of us find them repulsive. Although, if you don't want to turn vegan, you may soon need to get used to eat them. Their high factor of otherness renders Merian's dedication and her ability to depict them even more bewildering. She gave crucial contributions to the understanding of their life cycle with its process of metamorphosis. In her time, it was still largely believed, with Aristotle, that many insects generated spontaneously from dirt. In the middle of all the beauty, the caterpillars, the butterflies, the pineapples, and the lemons, a comment on plate 45, which depicts an exemplar of the plant Flos pavonis, caught the attention of science historian Londa Schiebinger, who quoted its English translation in her 2005 paper titled Agnotology and Exotic Abortifacients, the Cultural Production of Ignorance in the 18th Century Atlantic World. Open quote. The Indians and Africans, who are not treated well by their Dutch masters, use the seeds of this plant to abort their children, so that their children will not become slaves like they are. They told me this themselves. And with this very humane passage, written some 300 years ago by a champion of non-anthropocentrism, the first session of our book club comes to an end. So, there's always a short biography after each text of Occulto, and the one in this case includes some information about how the text was born that maybe are interesting to read. This text expands my introduction to the panel discussion I organized during the third edition of Fracto at Akut Berlin in May 2019 and found further inspiration in the lecture von der disziplinierten Wissenschaft zur interdisziplinären Forschung, circa 1850-2020, held by postdoc lecturer Arne Schirmacher at the TU Berlin in the summer semester of 2019. Maybe some more comments on the text, possibly starting with the title, Degenerates, they return into humans. This is actually twisted, slightly modified quote of Slavoj Žižek, not from a work of his. I don't want here to discuss his work, but from a sort of half-private video that made it to YouTube, where he's working with some people and they have to go for lunch and they discuss about where to go. And he mentions a restaurant in the neighborhood, but then he's told that it is a vegetarian food only restaurant. And he reacts saying, degenerates, they return into monkeys. And it's not so much about him, even though sometimes he can be as witty as controversial as he is controversial. It's about a very still quite persistent and pervasive vision about the status of humans among other animals, and what we could do to criticize it and discuss it and embrace complexity and diversity. So it's not meant as a typical science word dualism where philosophers don't understand science, but rather as a widespread vision that can be found also within science, and that this text tried somehow to discuss and approach in a different way. I mentioned a panel discussion that was related and started the research I did for this text, and in the same occasion there was also an audio work that was related to the research, and that was using sounds from a fantastic archive in Natural History Museum in Berlin, Tierstimmenarchiv. It's one of the biggest animal sound archive in the world, and it's all in Creative Commons license, even though we were in contact with them and got their support in this occasion. And the result was an audio piece created by the sound artist and experimental DJ J.T. Zazie in collaboration with me, that we just played as a sound installation in the yard during the whole Fracto edition, which is an experimental film encounter series happening yearly in Occulto. So, and as we talked so much about animals, we haven't seen many. I think the photos are a bit too small to be shown here. These are all cute animals in the East Berlin Tierpark. Here's the monkey we could turn into, according to Žižek. It's funny how evolution is sometimes still seen as a line, as a timeline you can go back and forth, which is really not the case. And we could even wonder now if becoming monkeys would be really that bad. Maybe not. Who's the degenerate now? This is just an invitation to confront ourselves with the other, or to try to consider ourselves as the others. In this sense, also the work for the audio piece, the editorial approach was to look for animal sounds that were a bit beyond cliché and beyond anthropomorphization. We looked for sounds produced by animals that are not that close to us, such as insects or reptiles, but also produced by unexpected animals. For example, very strong sounds produced from very small animals, and the other way around, so that the result is hopefully something you cannot classify so easily in a old MacDonald had a farm way. But at the same time, it is also an occasion to discover the whole range of sounds that happen in nature, that wildlife can produce. So my proposal would be to listen to this audio in a minute, and to thank again Dr. Karl-Heinz Frommold, that is the curator of the archive that supported this this project, and also J.D. Zazi that worked at the audio piece and that just has a fantastic new release called Memory Loss out that you may want to check. And as I mentioned, this text and the magazine it belongs to was released in late 2019, so this was our last pre-COVID issue, and there will be another one, a post-pandemic one soon. I don't know what I will do while we listen to the audio, but maybe I will try to show you or to type the names of some of the animals that we will listen to while we all hear the sound. So I think we can start.